So good evening, everyone. My name is Steve Edwards. I'm the Executive Director here at the IOP, and we are pleased to have you here for tonight's conversation that I think is so relevant to the process that we're watching unfold. It's certainly, I think, been one of the most combustible and unpredictable primary processes that I've witnessed in my lifetime. And I think for a lot of us, we may be asking, how in the heck did we get here? Is this any way to pick a president? What are the seed plantings that gave us the process that we have now, that we are watching and anticipating and analyzing with great eagerness with each passing primary. So tonight we'll get into the heart of that, which is fantastic. And I should say, without spoiling too much of the conversation to follow, that the history runs right through this city, right through Chicago in really important ways and fascinating ways. And I think some of you also may know that Chicago's hosted more presidential party nominating conventions than any other city in the country. So there's a rich history, and it's a history that involves our topic tonight. So I look forward to hearing what our guests have to say about it. I'm going to stop there and introduce Lucy Wark to formally introduce our two guests tonight, one of whom is not a guest, but a member of this family, because so many of you know her from her time here this past fall as a fellow at the IOP. It's always great to have you back with us, Jessica. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lucy Wark, who is a master's student here in the Masters of Arts program. She is from Brisbane, Australia. She's studying politics. Lucy, take it away. I got to give you the microphone.
We're on the record, Sam? Right?
Yeah. Most importantly, I just wanted to check before I begin, does everyone have a commemorative button? No? Yes.
Do you all have these buttons?
Yes, these are actually the original editions from the 1912 convention.
A perfect copy.
So thank you all so much for coming to tonight's talk on Geoff Cowan's new book, Let the People Rule, Theodore Roosevelt and the Birth of the Presidential Primary. This history explores a fascinating episode which took place at the beginning of the 20th century, where Teddy Roosevelt encouraged the development of popular primaries in order to win the nomination for the presidency. And the still powerful party machine's intervention led to a mass walkout at the Chicago nominating convention and the creation of the Bull Moose Party by Roosevelt. Now, as we've already heard, this is a wonderfully apt book at this particular time when many conventional wisdoms about American politics are being overturned by primary voters who are reacting against a perceived party establishment. And I look forward very much to hearing how Professor Cowan will flesh out that theme for us tonight. But to tell you a little bit more about Professor Cowan's background, in reading more closely about Professor Cowan's career this week, I actually did wonder several times whether there were in fact several men named Geoffrey Cowan. They were all sort of coincidentally working in similar or adjacent spheres of knowledge. You see, because all of our speakers at the Institute of Politics are impressive, but Professor Cowan's output is genuinely enough to induce an existential crisis about one's own productivity. So, sir, if you're using doppelgangers or some sort of time turner, you can come clean. This is a safe space. No? Nothing? Okay. Professor Cowan has actually a lot of connections with Chicago. His family, in fact, seemingly most of his family except him went to the University of Chicago. His father, his sister, his brother. I'm looking forward to an explanation of that, sir. He was also, born in Chicago and has worked on political campaigns in Chicago, so he has a long history here, and it's great to have you at the Institute of Politics for that reason. But to give a few more details about his actual career, Geoff Cowan is a lawyer, an academic administrator, a government official, a best-selling author, a distinguished professor, a non-profit executive, and my favorite, an Emmy Award-winning producer. Now, from 1996 to 2007, the professor served as Dean of the University of California's Annenberg School of Communication and Journalism. And in 2007, he was named University Professor, one of 21 at the university. I think the most interesting part of your biography, sir, at least to me, was that you're the inaugural president of the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands. And for those of us who may not have heard of Sunnylands, it's a non-profit organization which convenes high-level conventions and conferences for world leaders to address global challenges. So, for instance, in Hillary Clinton's welcoming message, she described it very nicely as the Camp David of the West. Its guests so far have included President Barack Obama, China's President Xi Jinping, and King Abdullah II of Jordan. And I'd love to hear about that too. Now, tonight, Professor Cowan will be in conversation with our own Jessica Yellin. Jessica began her career in 24-hour news and worked her way up, insisting all the way that she wanted to be White House correspondent. And when last quarter, Jessica was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics. And I was lucky enough to attend her seminars on the intersection of media and politics while she was here. And it is absolutely no surprise that she not only reached the White House, but became the first female chief White House correspondent. She covered the Obama and Bush White Houses for CNN. And since leaving broadcast news, she has done a number of cool things, the most important of which was, of course, being a fellow here. Yes. I was lucky enough to be one of Jessica's student ambassadors, and we had the easiest job in the world. It was wonderful because every seminar would sell out incredibly fast. All we had to do was usher people through the door. Jessica's also writing a book and pursuing a number of very interesting projects of her own. So in sum, it is wonderful to have her back here with us, and with that, I will hand over to you, Jessica and Jeff, to get started.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. We don't need this, right? No. Okay. So, pleasure to be here, I guess, interviewing you. We should confess to the group we've known each other a while.
A while. Eileen and I were trying to figure that out since you were 5, maybe?
I don't know if it was when I was 5, but
7?
maybe. I was probably the same height then as but I've always admired your career, and it's really a treat to be able to have this moment with you. I wanted to start, Jeff, by quoting something I read in the Washington Post. The Post recently wrote that if Donald Trump wins the Republican nomination over the objections of Republican Party leaders, he should send a note of thanks, this is a quote, to Geoffrey Cowan. Now, I don't think you're particularly a Trump supporter, that's my guess. So why would Donald Trump owe you a thank you?
Do you think I'll get a thank you?
I don't, actually. Lower your expectations.
Yeah, that's right. I might get some sort of maybe a tweet.
A tweet.
If I'm lucky, I'll get a tweet. So what that's referencing is that my book, as you know, is about the first time with ever presidential primaries, and we'll talk about that later, which happened in 1912 when Theodore Roosevelt tried to reclaim the presidency. But at that time, only a few states had primaries, 13 the year that he ran. And so the party leaders or bosses or whatever you might call them at the convention could override the will of the people. But in 1968, when Hubert Humphrey became the nominee in this city of the Democratic Party, not having won a single primary, the party changed its rules and required at that point that every delegate be selected by direct involvement of people in caucuses or primaries. That's been modified slightly since then, and the Republicans followed suit. And I put together the commission that led to that result.
So just to make that clear, as a young activist, you helped change the party's rules for nominating the presidential contenders.
I will confess to that, and we can discuss tonight whether it was a good thing or not, but I did do that, yes.
And so as a result, there's much more direct election of our nominees.
Totally. I mean, now, and it's one of the interesting questions today, and it's very much being disputed. Could somebody get most of the primary vote and not get the nomination? It hasn't happened since 1968. It did happen a lot before that. In 1952, for example, Adlai Stevenson of this state, in this city, became the nominee of the Democratic Party, even though Estes Kefauver had won, I think, all but one of the contested primaries, and Stevenson hadn't run any of them. So it had happened many times, and it happened with Humphrey, and it happened with Roosevelt in 1912. I would ask you and ask the audience to think about, is it even possible today that, let's say, Bernie Sanders won 60% of the delegates, or 6% of the popular vote, or that Trump, who won't win that percent, but won overwhelmingly in the states, that they could they could be denied the nomination? I think today that's hard to conceive of, even though people are speculating about it. It's the result of the reforms that I was a part of, and certainly of what Teddy Roosevelt was a part of. And we can discuss whether it's a good thing or not, but I think in the end I believe it is a good thing.
Okay, I'll challenge you on that.
Do please. We're in an academic environment. That, by the way, that's why I didn't go to the University of Chicago. I'm afraid I'd be challenged.
Let's go back a little bit just to put this in context, because I do want to really tie this to present day. But so we understand the sweep of our history on this. I think it's very hard for a lot of, especially younger people, today to believe that voters didn't have a very direct say in who their party nominees would be. So when the country began, how did we choose our nominees?
Right. Well, there were 4 stages of the selection of nominees, and it's interesting. We don't think about it. We all understand the Electoral College, or we think we understand it. We understand how presidents are elected in the final runoff. There's very little attention spent on how we nominate people. But from the time of the beginning of the Republic until 1832, the nominees were picked through something that was derisively called King Caucus.
King Caucus.
King Caucus, which was that the congressional delegations of each party would decide. So it's as though the Republican delegation in Congress today would decide who the Republican was going to be, and the Democratic delegation in the Senate, in the Congress, would decide who the Democrat would be. In 1832, that was changed basically by Andrew Jackson, and we created conventions, and from 1832 until 1912, all the decisions were made at political conventions, where the people at the conventions were picked in a number of different ways, but they would include mayors, it include people who we might think of as big city leaders or bosses, people who, for one reason, either dispensed or benefited from patronage, mayors, governors, etc., senators, but the individual voter had nothing to say about it. And so that change took place for the first time in 1912.
So until 1912, it was just muckety-mucks, and then people who owed the muckety-mucks something who got to
I
these
think that's a good
conventions.
description. The muckety-mucks and the people beholden to the muckety-mucks, probably.
And if I was a voter home in Illinois, I wouldn't necessarily know what they were going to do on my behalf going in. I didn't have a say in it.
I don't know how that would work in each state, but you didn't have a say in it.
I didn't have a say.
You might know something about it, but you wouldn't directly have a say in it. If you didn't like what the muckety-mucks and the people beholden to the muckety-mucks were going to do, there was very little you could do about it, except for maybe get the muckety-mucks out in the next election.
Right? Sounds hard. And that's when TR came along. Theodore Roosevelt
Right.
comes along and says, this is going to change. Now, looking backwards, we can say, oh, that was such a noble goal. He wanted to give the people a much greater voice. Describe the context of the moment.
I think I should set it up this way. People hear and have an image of Theodore Roosevelt, who's such a larger-than-life presence, we still feel like we know him. Because Roosevelt had been this charismatic figure who was a cowboy in the North Dakota, the Badlands, and who had been a police commissioner of New York. Novels are written about his life, arresting bad guys as a police commissioner in New York, and had been the Secretary of Navy fought for a larger Navy, and had, in the Spanish-American War, put together the Rough Riders, and so he actually became kind of a personal war hero of himself, and governor of New York, and a kind of a crusading governor, and president of the United States, under whose watch the Food and Drug Administration was created. And we think of him, I think inaccurately, but we think of him as a trust buster from that period. And we remember him as having protected, I think fairly, the majestic American wilderness. Working often with Gifford Pinchot, whose name some people may remember. He was a great figure, people thought. And so he was president after McKinley became vice president under McKinley. McKinley was assassinated soon after he was reelected in 2001. And so Roosevelt served as president from 2001 until 2008. And he believed 1901 to 1908.
Time travel.
Time travels. 1901, 1908. And he thought that he should follow the rule that Washington had established, that people didn't serve more than 8 years in office, so he didn't want another term. So he picked as his successor, and really did handpick and coach as his successor, the man he called the most lovable man he knew, his friend, his protege, William Howard Taft. So Taft became the president. Roosevelt leaves the country to go on a hunting safari. That's another thing he loved to do, and he was a tremendous naturalist. Hunting safari to Africa, comes back and hears from Gifford Pinchot, his forester who had helped to protect the wilderness, has been fired by Taft. He starts to hear stories about how Taft is not the proper heir to him, and he begins to think about running for president. I believe, as you know from the book, that he decides to run for president really because he's feeling alone and depressed living in Long Island, and wants to be back in the center of action where he can do some good. So I think he had other motives too. At first he thinks that he can be reappointed by his old chums, who were the muckety-mucks and the people who worked for the muckety-mucks, or whatever your phrase was. Because after all, he had been president with those people, and Taft actually wasn't that popular a president. So at that moment, the idea of primaries had begun to emerge and was being championed by a senator from Wisconsin named Robert La Follette, whose name will mean something to people here. And 6 primaries had been created by the fall of 1911, and La Follette is trying to expand the number of primaries, and Roosevelt opposes it because he thinks the old bosses, his old friends, will put him in office. He opposes it until he suddenly realizes that the incumbent, even if he's kind of soft and fat and
Literally.
and literally,
Yeah.
and not a very effective president, has enough power to maintain the power. So then Roosevelt decides to champion the idea of primaries, and his campaign theme becomes "Let the people rule," and the effort to create more primaries and to run in those primaries himself.
So, to put a point on how people thought in that era, though, so there was a time right before this when I read it. He supported the concept that only certain people are fit for democracy.
Also true.
So before he was for the people, he was sort of not for the people.
Yeah, well, he always thought that only certain people were fit for democracy, and among his illustration of that was that you wouldn't want democracy in Haiti, and that a mistake to have a democracy, and he specifically says, and it's part of the story later too, of course, that Mississippi under Reconstruction rule was in bad hands when the people could vote there, speaking specifically of African Americans. So he was not for democracy in that way, and as you know, he also was not for women's suffrage. So a lot of the things that we consider part of democracy were not exactly on his list.
Right. And I was interested to read about the environment at the time too. It sort of, the picture you paint at this moment has progressives denouncing Wall Street control of Washington, party leaders who are at odds with the people, political experts worrying that extremists in the parties were too powerful and threatened to hurt the country.
Does it sound too familiar?
It sounds like CNN. So it was an environment in which there was a lot of political panic in a way.
Well, there had been political panic. There was his effort to win, to regain the White House also became a very strident campaign. And he loses the first 3 primaries. There were 13 in all. But the first 3 primaries in American history he loses, including the primary in New York State where he had been the governor. Loses 2 of them to La Follette, 1 to Taft. And his rhetoric becomes so extreme and harsh that publications like The Nation and the New York Evening Post and the New York Times just talk about him as though he's gone crazy. And the internal dialogue that people say, Taft's own internal letters from people say, is it that he's drinking? Is it that how can he behave so irrationally? That's what they all were saying up until the time he began to win. Of course, when he wins his first primary, by the way, was right here in Illinois.
Talk about that a little bit, because you focus on the way primaries can change momentum.
Yes.
And why that was so important in sort of our political trajectory and giving the people a voice.
True. I mean, people didn't know it at that point. You know, remembering there had been no primaries, so it's all a new thing at that point. And so there had been 3 primaries. They'd gone against him. He had a lot of people who didn't like him for other reasons anyway. His rhetoric is becoming strident. He's been humiliated somewhat. And then comes Illinois. 4th primary takes place on April 9th. And it's a fascinating story, I think, of what happened in Illinois. And here we are in a place that's interested both in politics and the press. You're interested in the press. And the story of the Chicago Tribune is quite extraordinary. The Chicago Tribune was owned by the McCormick family. People here know that. Medill McCormick went on later to become a U.S. senator and did ultimately support him. But the Chicago Tribune is actually run by a guy named James Keeley, totally at that time. And Keeley loved running crusades. He ran a crusade first to put a primary on the ballot here, and then for Roosevelt's election. And that crusade included paying for his train travel, paying for arranging all of the events, but all secretly.
A newspaper paid for
A
this.
newspaper was doing all of that. And the top political correspondent for the paper at the time, a guy named Cal O'Laughlin, and if you were reading him, you'd think he was a political correspondent, which he was, but he was also both Roosevelt's friend and constantly giving reports to Roosevelt about who to talk to, how the thing is going. I say he was a journalist by day, and he was moonlighting as a political operative by night.
So journalists have been conflicted for years.
It did not start with Fox News.
No comment. So the picture at this moment is you have an ex-president who's come back to run against the president he appointed, basically, or
Right.
handpicked for the office. Begins to push for these primaries that are starting throughout the country.
Right.
He's winning some of them. He ends up gaining enough momentum that it seems like he actually wins the popular vote headed into the
I mean, his people legitimately felt that they had gotten 70% of the delegates picked through these 13 primaries, that the people were for him, that if there had been primaries everywhere, he would have won, and that's, I think, unquestionably true. Plus, that the way in which Taft had run, I mean, there are some incredible stories, but, you know, gunplay and all kinds of crazy things go on where Taft gets the nomination, gets delegates in ways that today would be considered not very ethical. And so Roosevelt thinks, and his supporters think, that he should be the nominee.
So you get to a convention that happens here, and under unprecedented circumstances, because we never had this popular
Right.
vote quite like this, and it's still not clear who's going to win that convention.
Roosevelt needs about 50 more delegates to win. By the way, La Follette had 36 delegates. He was never going to get those delegates. La Follette hated him, and he hated La Follette probably more than either one of them hated Taft. So he wasn't going to get those 36 delegates. He had to get 50 more delegates, at least. And to do it, he had to get people to shift from Taft to him. So he tries credentials challenges. People here are very politically sophisticated. You know about what credentials challenges are like.
Do you know what credentials challenges are? Because I kind of don't.
Oh, good. Well, let me tell you about credentials, because it never happens anymore, but I
Right.
have been through it. So 2 slates of delegates go from some state to one, let's say, one group was picked through a caucus where the people in the caucus, only certain people were allowed to vote. The people were kept out of the caucus because the people around the caucus knew that they were really going to be Roosevelt supporters. So they're kept out of caucus. Maybe, for example, the delegates from Detroit never make it to the Michigan convention because somehow their train is delayed. So all kinds of things happen like that. And it turns out that the caucuses are quite corrupt and money changes hands and so forth. And so the credentials challenges say, well, these people were picked the wrong way. I mean, to just give you one little example, because it's an easy one to describe, California at that time had a winner-take-all primary. But Roosevelt won California by 76,000 votes.
Wow.
By the way, women could vote in California, interestingly, and two of the delegates from California at the Republican convention that year were women, first time there were ever women at a convention. But so Roosevelt's delegates win by 76,000 votes. They think they should get all of the 26 delegates from California. Makes sense. But Taft had won in one of the congressional districts. And so Taft said, I should get the 2 delegates from that congressional district. And the Credentials Committee agreed because the party rules said you're supposed to be picked by congressional district. So there was a conflict between the state law and the law of the National Committee. And Taft's people said, I deserve those 2. So there's a credentials challenge to those 2 delegates.
And this is relevant today because we're looking ahead to a convention where potentially one way to skew an outcome could be through credentials challenges.
Well, yeah, I mean, for example, I think that in Iowa there's a whole question about the flipping of a coin. So I don't know just what's going to be said about the flipping of the coin. Or in the Republican Party, there's the question of the suppression of a vote because supposedly Ben Carson had withdrawn or something. So dirty tricks then could be the basis of a credentials challenge. So there's a credentials committee that decides these challenges. But the thing about credentials committees and conventions themselves is it's a power play. The decision is made by people who have been picked by the political insiders, and the last thing they're going to do is make a political decision in favor of their opponents. So it was clear to anybody, and you see this in the book, the insiders all knew that Roosevelt couldn't get the 50 delegates that way. But Roosevelt, a lot of his supporters thought that they would they wanted to walk out and start a third party. By the way, something like this could happen this year. But they wanted to walk out and start a third party, but to do it, they had to have the public on their side. And so one of the fascinating phrases that was used in their internal comments was they wanted to be defeated with grievances. So they'd lose those credentials challenges, they'd make them look good to the public, as good as they could, and they'd say, we were screwed, we're the real Republican Party, we're going to start our new enterprise.
And follow us.
Yes.
Right.
That's what they were doing publicly. Privately, they had another way of winning. And one thing that's interesting is, and I don't quite understand why this is, because a lot's been written about this campaign over the years. But if you've read about it, you think that it was about those credentials challenges and then they walked out. But there was a whole nother path to victory. And that was that there were 68 African American delegates from the Deep South. And Roosevelt's managers thought that they could get 50 of those delegates to change sides. They hoped to get 50. So a campaign goes on right here in Chicago to try to get those 50.
And their votes count.
And their votes count. They even though the Jim Crow laws in the South, which, by the way, became much stronger during Roosevelt's years as president. I'm not saying he was responsible for it, but it happened during those years. But those votes were pledged to Taft, or not pledged to Taft, but likely to go to Taft. And Roosevelt says, you should support me. I'm the guy who will be good for blacks in the South. And so a whole campaign is run. Maybe some money changes hands. There's a lot of reasons to believe that it changes hands, or there's an effort to have it change hands. But in the end, only 8 of those delegates leave Taft and go to Roosevelt. So when Roosevelt walks out of the convention and walks to Orchestra Hall, a place you guys all can picture these places here in Chicago, and walks to Orchestra Hall and has a couple of thousand people there, including these black delegates and also challenged delegates, black delegates in the South. And he announces at that place, we're going to start a new party right here in Chicago in 6 weeks. You go home. You pick the delegates from your states for our new progressive party, come back here, and we'll start the new party, and if those delegates want me, I'll be your nominee. And he says famously, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. There was, by the way, a religious subtext also. So everybody goes home, and they try to help start their parties at home. So these black delegates go back south, and they assume they're going to have a key role in this new party. But they're told, not only are they not going to have a key role in the party, they're not going to be allowed to be members of this new party. And that's the most shocking part of the story, and I'm amazed that the story's never been told before.
Whose decision was that?
Well, in the end, it was Roosevelt's decision, and we know that it was Roosevelt's decision. But my focus then in the book, and in my fascination with this thing, shifts to Mississippi. Some people here will remember the summer of 1964 and the challenges that took place for Mississippi, and I happened to be down there that summer. Something almost the same happens. 8 amazing black men, who I've come to know them and their descendants, organize an interracial party. They say, Roosevelt can't mean this. We're going to go to Chicago with an interracial party and challenge the all-white party. So they organize this interracial party. They come back to Chicago, 2 delegations, one all-white, one integrated, and they, with a lot of grit and determination, make their voices heard here. And the Credentials Committee, again, it's a credentials challenge, they're saying, we were kept out of the party, we shouldn't have been kept out of the party, it was made an all-white party, we should have been able to participate. They make that argument. The Credentials Committee at the new Bull Moose Progressive Convention, champion all the advanced ideas of the age, decides at 3 o'clock in the morning of the day the new Bull Moose Party is going to start its meeting, 3 o'clock in the morning, after 2 tied ballots, the Credentials Committee decides on a 17-16 vote with 1 disputed proxy to go with the all-white delegates and exclude the blacks.
And why did they do that? First of all, I want to make clear that Bull Moose was the third party that TR broke away from the Republican Party and formed. And initially it sounded like he was going to be a champion of the blacks in the South. Was there a political reason he made that call?
I think there's a total political reason. By the way, I should say, if you want to sort of think more charitably of Roosevelt, by that time there were a lot of women in the convention, first time. He had been against women's suffrage until after the primaries were over, but by this time now he's championing for the new party.
He was a champion of women's suffrage, though, to get more votes. Wasn't he not necessarily because he...
Let's just say many of the women's suffrage people of the period felt that way. And he also allowed for the first time at a major convention African Americans from outside the South, which was a kind of advance. It's
So why not just let the black voters come in to get more votes?
Because there were no black votes in the South. He had no chance of winning any of the elections in the South. And he told one of his friends, a guy named John Milliken Parker, who later became governor of Louisiana, actually ran for vice president on the Bull Moose Party in 1916. But Parker was one of his main advisors in this thing from the South. He said, if I could win one Southern state, I would die happy. And his mother was a Georgia Belle. Some of you remember this. Two of his uncles were Civil War heroes on the Southern side. His father, by the way, didn't serve. He had bought his way out of serving. He had two uncles on his mother's side who were Confederate heroes. And I think maybe he thought he could help to heal some of the wounds of the Civil War, rationalized it that way. He also, but in some of his correspondence, or his son's correspondence, I'm sure speaking for him, they talked about these men having no intelligence and being, and you referenced earlier, Jessica, his belief that some people weren't fit for democracy. The thing about these 8 men were, and what I think I'm able to demonstrate in the book, he knew several of them. One of those 8 men was a person he had asked to nominate him, to second him for vice president. His name was never put in nomination. But when he was still in the party, he wanted to nominate him for vice president. Another, and that man was a lawyer who went on to great success. Another was a Harvard-trained doctor who he excludes.
A black man.
Black man, Harvard-trained doctor. Give Harvard credit, by the way, as well as Sidney Redmond. But yes, a Harvard-trained doctor. Several were lawyers and business executives at the same time. These were amazing men. And I then decided I wanted to find a shoebox full of letters from the period. That's what historians do. You look for shoeboxes. So I tracked down their descendants, which, by the way,
of these 8 black delegates.
Of these 8 black men. And by the way, if anybody here thinks of themselves as potentially a historian, when I was an undergraduate, my old friend Peter Darrow was a serious historian in school. I tried to be, but I never knew what fun it could be to be a historian until I began to track down shoeboxes. But anyway, so I'm trying to find a shoebox with, and I get to know who the children and grandchildren were. And listen to this, Jessica. The children and the grandchildren of these 8 men, one of them had a son who became the first black judge in the continental United States, federal judge in the continental United States. Another one had 2 children whose names some people will know here, or you'll know about them. Some people remember a play that was a Pulitzer Prize winning play by Kaufman Hart called You Can't Take It With You. One of the stars of that original play was Ruth Attaway. Her father was one of these men who was excluded. And her brother, Bill Attaway, became a writer and musician who did a lot of things, but his most famous song, everybody here will know, which Harry Belafonte made famous, Banana Boat song, Day-O, Day, that was his song, son of one of these men. The nephew of 2 of these men wrote what is still the great history, some people, there might be a sociologist or 2 in this room, the great sociology study of Chicago is called Black Metropolis. Okay, Black Metropolis was written by the nephew of 2 of these men. And one of these men, one more of them, had incredible descendants, one of whom 3 months ago became the new president of the University of Missouri. These were the men that Theodore Roosevelt excluded from the party in part because they had no intelligence at all.
Would you describe, just so we remember the era, what some of just the mechanisms of voter suppression were, just quickly at that time?
Well, yeah. There were, the most serious one was you had to pass something like a literacy test. You had to interpret the Constitution. The reason that is such a serious thing, and that has existed in our own lifetime, it does not exist today. The reason that particular method is so difficult is that it's up to the discretion of the voter registrars to decide whether you've interpreted the Constitution correctly. So it's extremely hard to pass that test. But there are other things too. For example, there were poll taxes, which were very expensive for people to pay, and other things like that. the thing was that there was also a grandfather provision written into these voter suppression laws you're talking about, these laws that were sort of post-Reconstruction laws. And what a grandfather clause meant was, if you had been able to vote in a state, if your ancestors had been registered before 1865, you were exempt from those laws. Well, that applied to a lot of people, but no blacks.
Right. So in the same moment, while they're really rigorously excluding blacks, there's a little bit of lenience toward women. Some women are allowed to vote based on what state you live in.
6 states by the convention had women's suffrage.
And I was surprised to read about one woman during, I mean, this is an incredibly rowdy convention. I should just preface this by saying,
my God.
It's nothing like are these scripted, made-for-TV sort of award shows
Well,
type
I mean,
things
I
we see
remember,
now.
so the 1968 convention, which I was at here, which was pretty dramatic with the police out in the streets. The big difference here is the police were in the convention hall.
Right. But it sounds like people were still throwing punches and screaming,
were.
and nobody's suppressing
Biting
them.
hands, and
Biting,
you're right.
yeah.
Absolutely. And Roosevelt's people's original plan was that there's one other way they thought they might take over the convention or something like it, which I didn't mention, which was that at a certain point in the convention, their floor manager was going to appeal a ruling of the chair of the convention being a Taft person, and shout out an appeal, and throughout the hall, particularly in the galleries, and the bleachers and so forth, but also with his delegates, they were going to shout and start to fight and say, "That's all right," and the whole thing would explode. And the idea would be that would terrorize them. That's the phrase that the Roosevelt people were using. It was going to terrorize them and actually have them decide that they should go for Roosevelt.
Wow.
So it was a pretty wild convention.
Pretty wild.
That guy, by the way, his name was Herbert Hadley, who was the governor of Missouri, who was Roosevelt's floor manager, and later said he didn't do that, even though Roosevelt's people expected him to, because he ultimately decided that it would just be so unfair and so horrible in terms of his results.
And at one point, some woman throws down some banner of Roosevelt and throws up a handkerchief and is rushed to the center of the room
Yeah.
and stands on the stage.
Well, yeah, there's a demonstration. This guy, Herbert Hadley, who's a very dramatic governor of Missouri, and people are looking for a compromise candidate, some rational people are, for this convention. Hadley seems like a plausible person. And there's this huge floor demonstration for Hadley at a certain point, and then it's disrupted by the woman in white. And the woman of white all of a sudden stands up and unfurls this banner of Roosevelt, and with a picture of him. And so everybody starts looking to her and shouting toward her, and she then becomes the source of their attention, and they, go around march around the floor with her, and she becomes the story of the moment, and Roosevelt's back in the news.
I really put a point on this one because I think when we hear a lot of, especially people in the press, talking about how this could be a wild convention season, these conventions could be wild.
They ain't seen anything.
Right. This is what, somehow in the recesses of our historic minds, we think that this is what we could someday have. Our conventions haven't been like this since, I guess, '68, really.
Every time a decision was made, which the delegates didn't like, which was a pro-Taft delegation, they accused Taft of what they called a steamroller. So the delegates said, "Choo choo, choo choo," the steamrollers going. It was wild what was happening on the floor of the convention. And also the chair of the convention, who Roosevelt, I think, very reluctantly opposed to be the chair, was a great New York lawyer and the senator from New York named Elihu Root, who had been the Secretary of State under Roosevelt and actually won a Nobel Peace Prize. And he had been the chair of Roosevelt's own convention in 1904. Roosevelt knew he was a great man. But Elihu Root was so alienated by stands that Roosevelt had taken that he felt he had to support Taft.
So to fast forward to the modern era, in the end, TR didn't win.
Correct.
Either the convention or the presidency that
True.
year. But he did usher in our primaries. And you have argued that a number of presidents would not be in their office were it not for primaries.
It's true. I think that in people's, some memory here, some people have read about this, John F. Kennedy would not have become president, wouldn't have been nominated by the Democratic Party if he hadn't won in the very Protestant, largely Baptist West Virginia, where he proved that a Catholic could win. In fact, the Catholic bosses of that period, many of them didn't want him nominated, even though many of them liked him, because they were afraid, they didn't want to see a Catholic lose again. But all of a sudden he won in West Virginia. They couldn't turn him down. So he's one example. Ronald Reagan, and it's hard to believe that being on the eve of your 70th birthday sounded old once, but it did in 1980. And so people thought that that Reagan could not be a strong and vigorous president by campaigning vigorously in the campaign. He turned that around. And of course, and you were there, Jessica, in 2008, I think it's almost impossible to imagine that Barack Obama could have been nominated as president, starting with, had it not been for his victories, starting with the pretty all-white state of Iowa, which said to Democrats generally and to black leaders, as the Kennedy thing had said to Catholic leaders, that the United States was ready for an African-American president. So I do believe that without primaries, some of our major presidents would never have been elected.
Do you think the primary process works, our current process?
I think there are a lot of ways in which it can be improved, and I think a lot of people should talk about that. I hope that there are reforms that are brought about in the process. Although the reforms, by the way, are always designed to do the same thing, which is to help whatever the insiders think is best for the insiders. Same old system. But I think the primary process works in this sense. I thought a lot about the old adage, which many people here know, from Winston Churchill, where he said that democracy was the worst form of government, except for all the others. And I always sort of thought that was a cute line, and actually used it often in classes about free speech. You know, it's the best system except for all the others. Freedom of the press, same thing. But then I began to think about it in this context. The others, totalitarianism or communism, it's worse than democracy. But I think the primary system is the same way. I think it is a mess, but I think the alternatives would be worse.
Can you explain this piece of it, which I personally can't get my mind around, is that the way we elect our presidents in the nominating process is controlled by private entities. The parties really set the rules, and the parties are private. And yet, once we have our nominees, then it flips over to rules laid out by government, effectively.
Yeah, it is strange, and I think something that's also not widely understood. And of course, as you know, I go into some detail in the book. I hope not too much detail, but important just enough people can understand what's happening. It turns out, and the courts have been very explicit about this in years since, and I'll give you one good example, which most people will remember to show you this is true. But the same way the National Football League controls the rules for football, you're not going to get a court or lawmakers to tell you what's a safe pass and a safe catch and so forth. Those are rules that are made by the National Football League or the baseball leagues and so forth. The parties are deemed to be private organizations. They make their own rules. And to give you an illustration within the lifetime of I'll give you one from 2008, which Jessica, you're probably covering it. The parties create rules saying in what order states can have their conventions or can pick delegates. So Florida cheated, picked its delegates too early. And the Democratic National Committee said, we're going to cut in half the number of delegates in Florida. How can they do that? Because they can do it. You don't follow our rules? Yeah. And there's no way in which that could have been appealed. It ultimately changed because Obama had a lock on the nomination by the end. That was such a rule. And some people remember that in 1968, after the 64 campaign, 1968, a challenge delegation was named from Mississippi, part white, part black, a little bit of an echo story I've told you about, instead of the legally elected all-white delegation from Mississippi. How could the convention do that? They were overruling Mississippi law, and not because a court said the Mississippi discriminated. The rules of the parties are actually made by the parties.
And this applies this year as well. I mean, I know one of the things that we cover in the political media obsessively is what are the rules going to be this year versus last year. One of the big changes for the Republicans is come March 15th, you get these winner-take-all states.
Correct.
But prior to March 15th, every state that has a Republican vote, it's proportional apportionment of the delegates. How is this legal? I mean, why is this constitutional?
Well, maybe it will be challenged again, and depending if there's ever another ninth judge in the court, who knows what they'll decide. But there's, up until now, what the courts have said is that these are private associations. You don't need to be a member of a party. I don't, by the way, one of the important decisions came out of Chicago. I've forgotten, there was a alderman who had a challenge delegation in Chicago named Singer. Bill Singer. Some of you may remember that. He had a case that became one of these cases that helped to affirm the fact that the parties could decide by for themselves. That is pretty much settled Supreme Court law. I'm not saying it could never change. What I've wondered, Jessica, is this. Since the parties have this power, couldn't they use it for some good things?
Definitely not.
Well, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party generally is in favor of campaign finance reform. There are limitations on campaign finance reform that are put in by the Supreme Court, and limitations that are Congress doesn't go as far as people think they should. What if the party said that no candidate can be named to put nomination who has done X, Y, or Z? Or the Democrats are upset about voter suppression laws in various states. What if they said that nobody could be nominated, no delegates could come or be seated from a state which did X, Y, or Z? It's something I've been thinking about since I wrote the book. I don't know if it ever would be done. I don't know if there'd be rules that in the end would be good ones. But I think the power you're talking about, just like the National Football League could suddenly decide that they were abandoning football because there are too many concussions, or that there had to be much stricter rules because of concussions, and it wouldn't require a law to do it.
Right.
I think it's possible that there are things that the Democratic and Republican National Committee could do that would be good things.
I love that. Advocate for that. We'll get on it.
Take it from here.
Okay.
Institute of Politics, you've got power.
I'm going to open it to questions. I have one last question for you, and then you guys get ready to ask some questions,
Yeah.
which is, there's a lot of talk about the Republican convention potentially being brokered convention this year. The thought being, if nobody has a majority of the delegates. Structurally, what would that look like?
Yeah. So you think I'm the only person in the room who can remember a brokered convention. The last time that the Democrats had a convention, by the way, which went to 2 ballots, was here in 1952. I think, and like the last time Republicans did was 1948. So it goes back quite a way. We haven't seen a brokered convention in that sense for a very long time. But it could look like this. Let's say that the Donald Trump walks in. I forget, what's the number of delegates you need to get the Republican nomination? Does anybody here know?
1,237.
1,200. How many?
Either 1,237 or 1,273. I can't remember.
Okay, but 12 plus. 12,000.
Yeah.
Okay. So suppose he goes into the nomination into the convention with fewer than that. Let's say he goes in with 1,100 delegates, but he's won most of the delegates. And in fact, he's won a majority of the contested state delegates, because there are, since you have these figures, I appreciate, how many superdelegates does the Republican Party have?
I'm not sure of that.
But superdelegates are party, how many?
168.
A lot less than the Democrats.
Yeah, Democrats have more.
150.
Yeah, Democrats have more. But superdelegates being people who are party leaders and so forth. So let's say that if those delegates were apportioned according to the primary vote, Trump would make it. But he needs those people to make it. So he doesn't have enough to make it on the first ballot. Another thing that's happened is that Trump has gotten those, let's say he gets 1,200 delegates, a number we can work with. So let's say he's won 1,200 delegates. But the people who were the delegates, Jessica, aren't really for him.
Right.
And you saw that in this book. So that, because there's a different process by which people vote in many instances from who those delegates are. Ron Paul did something like this, you may remember, with Iowa and elsewhere in 2012, I guess. I think 12.
Yeah, 12, you're right.
Yeah. So suppose that of the 1,200 delegates who were his delegates, actually 300 of them, for example, the delegates, say he wins Ohio, but Kasich actually picked the delegates from Ohio, but he won.
They're loyal to someone else.
They're loyal to someone
but
else.
They're committed to Trump.
Right. So now you could have a credentials challenge. You could have a rules challenge of certain kind where those delegates vote in a way that isn't what Donald Trump wanted. They vote again. They have to vote for him on the ballot on the actual ballot for president, but they can vote differently on a whole set of other issues. They could be issues, platform issues, but they could be rules issues. They could be credentials issues. If something like that happened, you could wind up with a convention that goes for a while. But here's another element of it that's, I think, so strange, and I have the feeling that in the room there are people who know more than I do, so I'd love to hear from them. It used to be that if a state wanted to have a favorite son, that person's name could be put in nomination. 4 years ago, the Republican Party said that you couldn't put a name in nomination unless 5 states supported, that is, a majority of the delegates in 5 states supported you. This year, it requires a majority of the delegates in 8 states. So I don't know what that's going to mean, though, but you probably couldn't suddenly get, let's say, people have wondered if Paul Ryan could all of a sudden emerge as the presidential candidate. Well, Paul Ryan will not have 8 states that have supported him. So I don't know, but on the other hand, maybe if enough people, these are power issues and the parties make their own rules, as we've just agreed. Maybe the party says, we'll suspend those rules.
Right. Why not? They're
Why
rules.
not? There are rules.
Right.
And now we allow Paul, we'll suspend
anoint Paul Ryan.
well, any congressman who's a speaker from Wisconsin can.
Right. Okay, let's take your questions. You must. Yeah.
So
Matthew, say your name.
Yes, Sam. Yeah.
I'll feign using this. My name's Matthew, so thanks to both of you for being here. And so in order to keep it fair, I'll ask one question for each of you. So my question is going to be about superdelegates and how they fit into the picture, of whether you had crafted their existence or whether they somehow came about, and why Democrats have so many more. And then my question for Jessica is, on the Democratic side, the Sanders campaign is all upset about the superdelegate allocation in the sense that they're defying the popular vote. So I'm curious how that compares and contrasts with your experience covering Obama in 2008 with the superdelegates, starting with Hillary and then switching to him.
First of all, I want to say both are great questions. And I regret that I have to let Jessica answer the second one. But on the first one, the Jeff Cowan of 1968 would not like superdelegates, because his position was that all delegates should be picked in the calendar year of the election through a process that would open to full participation. And that, in fact, was the rule in the Democratic Party for several cycles. And then the decision was made that I think it was probably affected by George McGovern being nominated, by Jimmy Carter being nominated, that you needed a little bit more wisdom or ballast in the system. And so what does the Jeff Cowan of 2016 think? Well, who cares?
I care.
Maybe he's not sure yet.
Right.
I haven't decided. But I want to say one other thing about Jeff. I think just one other thing. I do think it would be very hard if the party was, let's say that Bernie Sanders got 60% of the vote. I don't think the superdelegates could go the other way. I know that
Because of pressure, not by the rules.
Yeah, and that's what happened, as you know. But I'm sorry to get into this, Jessica.
you
It's
do
your
it.
question. But in 2008, for a while it looked like Hillary had locked up the superdelegates. But then they changed, and so they're not pledged to her now. And I think they're prudent enough so that they would change later. I don't personally think, and nobody here knows, that Sanders is going to win 60%. I think Hillary's going to win most of the delegates. And if that's true, then maybe their views will change. But do you want to?
I think.
Well, you were there in 2008, though. What?
In 2008, the superdelegates abandoned her well before the convention. She was very aggressive about insisting they were with her. And then they were constantly calling us, telling us that they're not, and they're going to announce it shortly. So by the time we got to the convention, we actually knew where things stood. The math was against her. And I think, you could see something similar with Bernie Sanders this year, but I tend to agree with Jeff that it's unlikely his math is going to add up to be in a position to really contest it.
Is there a tipping point that swung the superdelegates?
It was a bunch of factors, but by the time we got to Ohio, it was already, that was when actually Tim Russert went on television with his little If you remember this, he had a little whiteboard, and he did the math showing that because of these numbers, Hillary Clinton is not going to win the presidency this year. And actually, that was the moment in the campaign when she came to life. It was like she has nothing left to lose. She landed the day after that happened in an evening. She landed the next day in Ohio. I was at her first event there. It was a massive event, had like a fashion runway. And before she was like this controlled candidate who's speaking like that, she landed. Tim Russert had declared her dead politically. She gets on that runway and she starts marching down and she goes, "I'm Hillary Clinton and I want to be president of the United States." And the crowd erupted. And from then on, she was just like a real version of herself campaigning for presidency, but the math was already against her. Anyway. Who else? Lucy?
And back there,
Oh, okay.
In many states,
okay, well, let's pass the mic back. And maybe identify yourself too.
Jim Mann, an alumnus. In many states, the elected delegates are only pledged on the first ballot. How does that play into your equation as to what happens in a convention?
Well, that's really a
And
good
let me
point.
just, if
I'm
I
sorry.
can add one other observation. Even if it doesn't end up in a floor fight, I mean, certainly if you look at 64 and you look at 68, 72, the dealing that was going on certainly amounted to a floor fight over who was going to be selected as the nominees in the parties.
And it was also true in '84. I mean, I think '84 was the last time it was not completely clear until the end who was going to get the nomination, because Gary Hart had a very strong campaign. And I don't know for sure. People have, there are probably books that tell us this now, but I thought one of the reasons that he picked Geraldine Ferraro was that women at the convention were saying that they might go for Gary Hart if Mondale didn't, something like that. So anyway, delegates, and some of these pledged delegates may not even legally be pledged exactly in that same sense. They may not legally be pledged, but I think the thing that you're raising is not only the fact that they could do anything they want on a second or third ballot, but also the fact that they can be bargaining for different things. Who's going to be the vice presidential nominee? Who's going to be cabinet officers? What's your position going to be on changing this or that policy? What are you going to do with regard to to Iran or to Israel? So I think it's a good point that you could imagine, well, maybe Mr. Art of the Deal is really in his element if he gets to that point.
That's right. We can see how good a negotiator he is. All right. Lucy, did you have a question? Boy, girl.
Thank you. I have a question for Jeff. I was wondering what you think about the prospect and the likelihood of a party split happening and the creation of a new party today. You know, it seems inconceivable to us now with the ecosystem of, you know, think tanks and state party organizations and players who have an interest in the system as it is, that parties could split like they used to. So I was wondering, is there a qualitative change that's happened, or is it still possible and we're just being myopic?
Well, so I think it's really fascinating what's happening that way. First of all, we probably have all read fairly knowledgeable commentators who think there is that kind of split going on in the Republican Party. I'd only remind you that fairly knowledgeable commentators, forgive me, Jessica, haven't known anything this year.
True.
But there are people who have reason to say that. And if you look at one of the fascinating things to me in the Republican Party actually is let me suggest a couple of things that I think are big issues about Trump. First of all, I should tell you, and Jessica knows this from the book, the Republicans knew in 1912 that if they nominated Roosevelt, they'd win the White House again. So why didn't they do it? Because they felt they would rather stay in charge of the machinery of the Republican Party rather than giving it over to these, what they regarded as radicals, and lose the presidency, but keep the machinery of the Republican Party, and then they thought they could win again in 1916. I don't know if something like that's at work, but one, they have to really worry about, unless the Art of the Deal comes back in some way, they have to worry about who's going to control the party if Trump wins. That's not a small issue. But then you look at the substantive things. If the Republican Party has stood for something in the last several years, if you list the sort of 5 or 6 litmus tests, I don't think Trump is on their side on any of them. Well, okay, you're questioning it. I don't think for smaller government that he's on their side. I don't think he's been on their side clearly in terms of taxes. He's completely against them about campaign finance issues. He thinks the war in Iraq was a disaster and a lie, and probably thinks people should have been indicted for it. I may be going a bit further there. His position on the Middle East, well, I'm being recorded by somebody. His position in the Middle East, although if you put an iPhone for me, so it'll be safe. His position. Well, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I think it makes him kind of interesting. Trump. He has not been against whatever single payer is. He's raised questions about single payers possibilities, or some sort of a mandate at least for Obamacare. On the Middle East, he said that he won't take a position really fully about the Palestinians in Israel because he wants to be able to negotiate from. Well, where do the Republicans stand on that? So, Jessica, tell me an issue in which you would say that if you're the Grover Norquist wing of the party, you say this is our guy.
That's true. From the Grover Norquist perspective, well, personally, Grover Norquist not very pleased with him. They've been at it. I mean, on social issues now, he's claiming to be quite right.
Except he says Planned Parenthood is great except for abortion. I mean, which should be, by the way, probably the position of the anti-abortion people, but it hasn't been. They've been anti-Planned Parenthood, right. And by the way, federal money only goes to non-abortion stuff anyway. But he spoke out powerfully for Planned Parenthood. Right. I think that what's interesting then is, okay, if he's against us on, and immigration policy is back and forth, but the establishment wing of the Republican Party has been, and trade, he's against trade deals. I mean, he's against everything that they stand for. And so I mean, not literally everything, but a huge list of things. And so you could ask the question, if he becomes the nominee, what does that Republican Party stand for at that point? So going back to your question, I think it's interesting, but still, I think in today's world, it's hard to imagine them deliberately splitting off. Now, maybe a Michael Bloomberg type could be creating a vehicle that people could go into. But so far, Bloomberg does not seem to be, in my opinion, talking about a third party. He's talking about a third candidacy.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. If you say your name.
My name is Hanari. I'm a 4th year in the college. So we talked a little bit about earlier if whether or not it was a good idea for this primary system to happen, and also just the importance of the order of the state. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about like how that was decided and like what that means for the election to like start early with Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Nevada, and like what an alternative to that is. Is it like all primaries happening on the same day? And like what that would look like.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. If you say, okay, primaries are a good idea, but the system is a mess. It is a mess, by the way. It's dizzyingly confusing. Every state is different, both parties are different, it's different every 4 years. This room is filled with political junkies. My guess is that very few of you have any idea how the system works, except in a few states. I mean, it's really complicated. You mentioned the winner-take-all thing that takes place on March 15th. That's this year that happened. The eight states to get nominated thing is new. Some states have open primaries, some have closed, meaning you can have voters who are independents vote. Some places they can't. It's an incredibly complicated system, and so. A couple things. One, a national primary. In 1912, both the Progressive Party, TR, and the Democratic Party, Woodrow Wilson, who won the presidency, both favored a national primary. And in Wilson's State of the Union message, he actually called for a national primary. It never took place. National primary is a bad idea, in my opinion, because you couldn't get into it unless you had a tremendous amount of money to begin with, and also huge name recognition. So it doesn't really allow for people to grow the way sometimes they do as candidates. Regional primaries have been proposed by the secretaries. There's an association of secretaries of state. Every state has a secretary of state. They're the people responsible for elections. They have their own organization. That organization has proposed regional primaries with rotating regions. That would be expensive also, and it also, I'm just saying the downsides of the alternatives, and it would depend a lot on what region was first. If it was Northeast at first, it goes one way. If it's the SEC that's first, it goes a different way. So a lot of problems with that system. I don't think there are any of these systems that are so great, and I want to say a word for the much maligned Iowa and New Hampshire process.
You do?
I do.
Okay.
First of all, I'm going to say I'll say two words, Barack Obama. White state, if it's the first state had been South Carolina, I think it would have been an entirely different reaction.
Right.
It was like Kennedy in West Virginia. So first of all. But secondly, it might not be Iowa that's first. It might not be New Hampshire that's first. You can debate which state should be first. But I think there's a benefit to small states, which is that candidates have to engage in retail politics. And I think that that's a good thing on both sides. The disadvantage from a political science perspective, in my opinion, of it being those two states is that part of what retail politicking does, and you've been there, Jessica, and seen it, is that it influences the candidates. The candidates learn a lot about real people. But if those real people don't reflect the diversity of the society, it doesn't do the good that it can do. But I guess I like the idea of a couple of states coming first where candidates engage in retail politics. You don't have to be hugely rich to do it. Sometimes you can have somebody who will break out. One other thing is, there's a lot of criticism of a long process. A lot. And, you know, the network's getting good ratings. They may not be among those people complaining. They're getting a lot of money. You notice probably advertising, by the way, was up this quarter for the networks. Why?
Political ads.
Political ads. So there are a lot of, you know, you're not going to find that group opposing it. But long campaigns have a certain advantage, which is that people tend to be vetted more during a longer process. And maybe that's not a bad thing. And I think voters their ideas begin to evolve. And one reason why I'm still a believer in the process this year is I think people are going to, I still have more faith than not in the American electorate. And then they're ultimately sorting people out and thinking about this stuff. That's how I stand.
Okay, we are over time,
Oh,
so
no.
should we suggest that the rest of you have questions, do it when you're getting
Signing books, yeah.
Because he's going to go out there and sign books now.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, please join me in thanking Jessica.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks.